So you're going to open it?
Hi, and welcome everybody. We're still getting our second presenter up and running with the tech. So I'd welcome you to use the chat box to introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, and your organization or whatever hats you might be wearing in today's session. We will be getting started in just a minute. So please stay tuned. And you'll see me working back of house with Jim to try and get everybody up and running. So go ahead and use the chat box. Welcome, and we'll get started in just a second.
No.
Can you see me and hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. All right, you're doing it.
Welcome.
Yeah. Welcome. We can hang up. Thank you.
Good work, team. All right, I'll let you two take it away. We have some attendees in our list, and I've invited them to introduce themselves in the chat box, but go ahead and take it away. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tyler. Welcome, everyone, on this beautiful afternoon. People standing in front of their computer, sitting in front of their computer to join us today. Here, a little presentation of some of the work that our organization, our community has been doing related to healing racism, I guess in a simple phrase. It's a complicated subject, which is very rich. I know I've been engaged in for the better part of my 30 plus years working in the food system. Times I've thought I was pretty smart and ahead of the curve, and this past year has been particularly humbling from my perspective with the twin pandemics that we've been dealing with. Learning how much I don't know when it comes to understanding racism and the work that still needs to be done, both by me, by my community, by my organization. But what's been really invigorating during this period is the amount of information that's out there and the number of people specifically anti-racism. I think it's only appropriate that I acknowledge the shoulders of folks I've stood on to get here, including Daoud. Daoud lifted me up quite a bit as we worked together for 20 years in the food system. Times I thought I've been organizing him, he's been organizing me and bringing me along, teaching me so many important lessons. I'm actually not going to acknowledge the rest of the people at this point. I'm going to introduce Daoud and just say that I know that one of the things he's most proud to call himself is a farmer. I'm going to let him introduce himself further.
Thank you. This is a beautiful day. I just got my fencing up for the goats, so we let them out today. So I'm sitting here looking at them, and I'm really enjoying that because I felt like I had them in captivity until I was able to get the fence up. But it's up now, and I feel pretty good. My name is Daoud Omar. I've been around Portland for at least 30, 35 years or so, but got involved in the food system maybe 25 years ago, and have been sticking with it simply because I grew up eating government food, and I had made a pledge that before I die, I would like to be able to raise my own food and enjoy some of that. So that's what I'm doing out here. I'm trying to do a little bit of farming. But I've been working with the Cumberland County Food Security. I've been on their board for a while now. And one of the things that have come up over and over again, and we come to a particular point of how do we move forward from here. And it's been some things that I have been thinking about and have shared with Jim and others. And it takes a little bit different perspective of things. And I'm hoping that we be able to share some of those perspectives today as we go through this presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm the director of the Cumberland County Food Security Council. That's been my work for almost 10 years in the food system. Prior to that, I've initiated the first immigrant farming project in the state, the New American Sustainable Agriculture Project. Worked as a consultant during that time too. I did that when I was working with Coastal Enterprises. And prior to that, I directed the Maine Coalition for Food Security, first food security. So I've been being back against this wall of ending hunger, making sure that people have access to enough healthy, nutritious food in the state of Maine for 30 years. And, you know, it hasn't always been a struggle. There have been moments of success. And I think we're at a particularly right moment to harvest some opportunities related to resources and just new perspectives that will allow us to make significant progress. And that's the nature of today's presentation, which we're calling Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Repairing the Wealth Gap. It's going to touch on some of the work we've been doing, some of the work that's being done nationally, and look to the future of what we need to do to heal racism in our communities, in our state, in our country. We're going to touch on current policies being implemented and proposed. There's some really innovative things currently happening both at the state and federal level related to racial wealth gap, related to reparations, and other responses to structural racism. We have great leadership in the state. Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, Senator Craig Hickman was able to rejoin the legislature as a senator this session. We have really amazing people who are doing some really innovative and creative work, just some really visionary legislators that I call out those two in particular because that's their legislation is going to be what's referenced in this presentation. It's also, I think, important to recognize how we're all paying for the racism that exists in our society, what the true costs are, how we're all paying, and then how we can change the story about racism and choose a different path. So those are the topics that we're looking at today. There's really no linear way to tell nation's racism. It's complex. It's been built up over generations, and disassembling it is going to take all of us coming at it both on our personal level, the organizations we work with, in our communities. I think one of the things that Dawood reminds me is that people are living it right now, living the struggle, living the oppression, and working to change it. And those are the people that we need to really engage and invest in and follow the leadership of. And part of that does involve, and we've heard this during this conference, part of that involves, reviewing the history that we're telling ourselves, telling the true story of our history, retelling that history in ways that are actually represent what's happened, some of the things that have been hidden. And that's part of what we'll talk about today as well. So, I dropped that quote out about something you said to me this past week about people living it right now. I don't know if you want to add anything to that or any thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know, Jim, most of the time when you and I are talking, it's almost like I'm explaining things from a perspective that's trying to capitalize on our human worth, right? And so I normally look at us as a community, and that the community has been broken in some kind of way, mainly our spirits, and sometimes our human relations. And when I'm thinking about some of this stuff, I'm thinking about repairing that particular portion of the life that we don't normally talk about, and that's us as human beings. I know that sometimes when I explain to you, I say that, Jim, if you think about the body, or if you think about one of your bones in the body and you happen to break it, right? You happen to break the bone, it could start its own healing process on its own, but it will heal crookedly, and you'll wind up with a healed crooked arm and it be defective. However, if you was to say, okay, well, the arm is broke, prepare yourself, we're going to have to do a reset on this, and the patient is prepared for a reset and he's ready for a little bit of pain, and you basically reset it, wrap it up, and get it to the hospital real quick, then they could say that the thing is broke, and these are some of the things that we need to do. And I think that's what I try to explain to you in some of these things, is that our spirit and our condition has been broken as human beings. And in order to fix it, you're going to have to do a reset and come up with some different values and start a healing process from there. A healing process where we're coming together to heal together instead of healing separately and still broken, but healing in a crooked form. That's what I try to share with you in most of the cases. And I'm hoping that's what we could share with most of the people today as we talk about reparations or any type of healing or healing the wealth gap. So repairing the human being is the first process that I think we could focus on.
It looks like Jim dropped off. I'm not sure if he had an internet issue. There, he's back. Jim, perfect timing.
Yeah, no, that was an internet issue, and I apologize.
No problem, as long as you're all set.
Yeah, thank you for paying attention and jumping back in. You know, I think it's important to, in the conversations David and I had, to acknowledge that I was a military veteran who was a medic, and some of his analogies relate to the military and relate to healing. And I learn a lot in those conversations when he makes those references. The other thing I think, you know, when Dowd talks about the humanness, I know one thing he's been really missing in this work is the hugs. Dowd is, you know, a very loving and lovable person who, you know, really embraces his work and embraces the people he's working with. We talk about that, how important it is to bring love to this work and to bring joy to it. And so I think we intend to, as soon as we're permitted and we're not going to harm each other with potential infections, we're going to begin celebrating in new ways. It's going to be a great outpouring of joy as we get back to work in each other's presence, sharing the same air, even if we still have to wear masks, protect each other. But certainly that's something we look forward to. I think my screen is back up, and I think I will reference some of the policy work that's being done. I know that we talk about reparations. I think part of what that metaphor I was talking about the broken bone, and when we talk about reparations, sometimes what it might take to get to a place where we can actually talk about, you know, repairing humanity, repairing the humanness that's been broken, you know, may involve resetting some bones. There's maybe some pain we need to go through to get to that place. Certainly at the federal level, it's an interesting time, and there's some interesting dynamics going on around reparations. So I'm going to talk about that first. We're going to get to the main stuff a little bit later in the presentation. But HR 40 was actually something that was first introduced in 1989, the first kind of official time reparations were reintroduced in the modern era, and by Representative John Conyers, who has since passed, but looking at studying slavery and discrimination and what reparations would mean. But for the first time, I think somewhat in relation to one of those pandemics that emerged, racism, that the legislation has actually made it to the floor for the full House. So people are going to be held accountable for their votes on this legislation for reparations. I think, you know, related to that, I think there's a lot of local areas that have taken on reparations in different ways. Evanston, Illinois just took it on and passed a local bill that's allowing small grants to people. Being considered and has moved forward in places like California, statewide. You know, some communities even as near as Amherst and Providence. Some institutions like churches and major universities like Georgetown have also taken on their own individual reparation efforts. I think it's important to note that and to think about what we need to do as a state, what we need to do in our communities as we acknowledge the historic debt we have to people of color who were enslaved. So we're going to come back to that, talk about reparation a little bit later in the presentation. But I just wanted to note kind of where we are and some things that are currently happening. I think one of the things that we recognize is that reparations program must focus on eliminating the racial wealth gap. And I'm going to jump into some numbers right after this to look at what the racial wealth gap is right now. One of the things that our organization has been doing over the past few years is something we call the racial wealth gap learning simulation. We're not going to go through that right now because this isn't an interactive workshop, but it's going to talk about some of the numbers and then also some of the activities. And what I want to also use this moment for is to invite folks who are interested in doing this with their organization. And again, it works so we can be in each other's presence. I mean, it can be done through Zoom, but it's much more effective if we do it in person. So once we're in a place in the next 6 months or so, I invite folks to ask me to come to your organization, and I'm happy to facilitate an event, the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. I think one thing that some people, because it's a simulation, they view it as a game. It's not a game, it's very serious. So, but it is an important activity that, as you will see, if you go through some of the history, really important. It helps us to recover history and understand why we are where we are. So, again, we're the Cumberland County Food Security Council, and even though we understand that food insecurity does not exist without economic insecurity, that those are interrelated. And so these are some of the numbers in the most recent USDA. And this is before the pandemic. The most recent USDA food security measure is talking about the number of people facing hunger, number of people facing poverty in this nation. And again, I think I'll note this maybe more than once in this presentation. Sad fact that the biggest risk factor in Maine and in this nation for being hungry is being a child. And that is criminal in a nation that has the resources we have. And again, we can look at the national numbers, both prior to and during the pandemic. Black and Native American families are twice as likely as whites to face poverty, while Latinx prevalence was not quite double. And then Northwestern just recently did some research during the pandemic and found, just it tripled among households with children. And in Black households was nearly twice as high as white households. Again, you get tired of hearing the numbers, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge the facts. And so why is this disparity? Well, the disparity is a result of the racial wealth and income divide. And how did that come to be? Well, the useful tool of the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation takes you through 13 different instances in U.S. history since the Civil War, when we made policy choices as a nation that favored, advantaged people with white skin and disadvantaged people of color. This is one example. Land seizures that began after the Civil War but continued. Initially there was talk of 40 acres and a mule for African Americans, but never really came to be in a widespread way. And much of the people who did receive that benefit had that benefit taken away from them. And so this is an example of what we do during the simulation. We sit together, smaller groups. Ideally, you identify with, or if you're a white participant, you identify as a Black person, what your experience would be during this, when this policy choice was implemented, and vice versa. So this is one example. And I'm not going to read these. I hope your screen you can read these. It's a little bit on the small side, but it just is an illustration. Another one actually that's really important to note happened 50 years, well, actually not 70 years after the Civil War, the Social Security Act during the Great Depression, a time like what we've just been through with the great economic upheaval. We implemented the Social Security Act, and what it intentionally did was exclude people of color through excluding specific job categories like domestic workers and farm workers, which were mostly African Americans and people of color. So again, this is one example. When we do this exercise, 13 different instances. And this isn't, they're all but not comprehensive. It just shows. And one of the many instances that we talk about, Dio talks about this a lot as we talk about, economic upheaval and income disparity, the various wars. And we're not talking about the military wars. We're not talking necessarily about the Vietnam War. But we're talking about the war on hunger, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime, and the impact that has on communities of color. I'll pause for a minute and let Dio say a little bit about that.
I think when I'm thinking about those particular wars, they were basically started by presidents. It was an announcement that there was a particular war going on, and they had a war czar, somebody that was in charge of the crime, the war on poverty. Somebody of high power had an army. They had funds made available to go out, and these are some of the things that was anticipated. There would be captured prisoners, destruction of property, casualties, all sorts of things, right? The whole deal that goes along with being in war. And so if you have that and it's been paid for and funded by the government, or in their ideal of solving the problem, then I honestly think we have to look at our situation as a war being declared on its citizens. And anytime a war is ended, and I believe we're coming to the end of these wars, then reparations is paid at that point to repair the damage to those communities that was directly impacted. And now we have what is called collateral damage. Those people that wasn't intended to be affected in the way that the drugs were supposed to happen, the way that the poverty is supposed to happen, the way that the crime was supposed to happen. Now we have some residue. So if we was to treat it as a war, then I think we could come up with either, in our policies, it's either a peacetime policy where you're treating people as if though you go to the emergency room, whoever is harmed the worst gets resources. Whoever is harmed the minimum, you tell them, okay, be patient, and we'll be there to attend you. But right now, it's been identified that there's certain communities that's been harmed through COVID, which is a current event. There's community that's been harmed through these particular wars that's been a historical event. So we don't have to go too far back into slavery to see who needs immediate help now. All we have to do is look at these wars that's been declared, the effects, the amount of money that's been spent and still being spent, and try to retreat on some of those funds and help those communities that's been harmed the worst. That's how I basically see it. And I've been sharing that, and a lot of other folks is beginning to see it in that way. They don't like to use those terms because when you're trying to be peaceful, war is not something that you want to resort to, nor have too much of a discussion about. But we're beginning to see it in that way, and that's what the evidence is beginning to show. And we're beginning to see if this is a war that's been declared, we need people of goodwill to come forward with us and help form a peace treaty and kind of protect us, because we are kind of endangered. And that's something that we might want to discuss at a later date, but the community is endangered of not being in existence too much longer here in Maine, at least not the original African Americans. It may be some other groups that's coming forward, but not that group. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dow. Yeah, and and for people who need numbers, the evidence is there. This implementation of these various policies, and again, the way that we've chosen to share wealth and make wealth available has resulted in a 13-to-1 wealth gap. This is somewhat dated, but it doesn't change. It was the same in 1968. It's the same today. But even worse, when you look at people who are living near the poverty line, the difference between a black household and a white household of folks near the poverty line is between zero for a black household to $18,000 for a white household. So, when you get really that much closer to destitution, the threat is much greater. And again, when Dio talks about that, I mean, there's a theory of change called just transition, which it's like triage. You invest the resources in the people that are most at risk, most vulnerable. And certainly that's an important concept as we begin to think about how we transition out of the pandemic, how we help people recover, how we invest reparations to heal people through the two pandemics that are current. Again, here's just more numbers. This is work by the Maine Center for Economic Policy, according to some numbers about food insecurity in Maine by race and ethnicity. And then I'm going to shoot through some infographics that were developed by Yes Magazine that speaks to reparations and some of the history that we have liked and tried to ignore, that many people still want to ignore, but ask some really important questions. What does the country really owe Black America? What did we build on the labor of African American slaves? Various entities that profited, and the choices we made, beginning with emancipation. And again, policies are just choices we make together about how we organize our community. So a lot of times politics seems distant from us and seems like we don't have a lot of influence. I think particularly in Maine, we have a lot of power and a lot of influence, especially when we have leaders like Rachel Talbot Ross and Craig Hickman and many of the others who are really understand the dynamics and the need to make some of the transformative changes that we need to make. But it takes all of our voices together with some clarity to make some alternative choices. Again, and part of what influences those choices are the stories we tell each other. How do we understand our history? How do we understand where we are? What a difference in wealth gap, the household wealth of Black families relative to white families, and how we got here. So, when we are truthful with each other, we acknowledge real history, we acknowledge where we are and what brought us to this place. That's when we begin to understand the value of what the African Americans who were slaves built. And if we had actually given the wealth that we had promised after emancipation, that 40 acres and a mule to those families would be worth, 2 or 3 times as much as what we just freed up for pandemic relief. So that value has been integrated in every place of the economy, and it's a minimum of what we need to invest in supporting the most vulnerable people in this nation who paid so much to bring us to where we are today. People like to think we're the greatest nation on the earth. Well, if we're the greatest nation on the earth, then we need to pay the people that helped us become that. Again, just a little more facts and numbers. When you think about that $6.4 trillion, when you think about the percentage of African Americans in this country is 13%, they're only holding about 4% of America as well. Again, there's another imbalance there. And again, part of it is, we try to justify that with the stories we tell about people not being educated, being lazy, and we know that's not true. But they certainly are more vulnerable. Black families are much more vulnerable. So, what is our path? Acknowledging that. I think recently I was very blessed to hear Heather McGee speak. She was brought to a conference by the Maine Center for Economic Policy. She's just written this book called The Sum of Us, and it really speaks to how structural racism, while it does impact and make African Americans the most vulnerable, actually the structure that results affects many more white people than it does African Americans, because there are just that many more white people that are suffering poverty. And she has a lot of really interesting analogies. She's the first person that I heard explain why we need, rather than truth and reconciliation, we need truth, racial healing, and transformation. Because reconciliation would just take us back to a prior state where things were good, between, and that's where it might make sense between Native Americans and the dominant white culture to do reconciliation, because there was a time when there was an equality in relations, but that was never the case with African Americans who were brought here as slaves. So we need to really talk about racial healing and changing the structures that have come to be because of the oppression that resulted. So that's a different way of thinking about where we need to go with this population and the just transition that needs to take place. You know, another thing that Heather talks about is really important. You see the white kid diving off the diving board and African American girl climbing up the ladder. And there was a time, briefly, where there was anti-segregation. We began to bring schools together. We began to bring pools together, and that just became intolerable to white people. So rather than having shared pools, communities drained their pools and took those resources away. And that's a general attitude that a lot of communities have taken. If I can't have it to myself, I'm not going to share it, or I'm not going to invest in that. And I think that has had a negative impact on all of us. And that's, the sum of us refers to the perspective of kind of a zero-sum game where if someone gains, then I lose. I think it's really important that we transform that attitude and that perspective if we're really going to get to a place of kind of the rising tide, as they say in Maine, lifts all the boats. So it's really important that we remember that just because we're lifting up one community doesn't need to be the expense of benefiting all of us, especially when we're complicit. We want to reclaim our humanity, not be complicit in maintaining the suffering of folks. So again, here's some interesting numbers that speak to that. Maine ranks second in the bottom in the U.S. That was the last USDA food security, household food security measure, which has been around since 1996. And that was released in September. It tracked the period 2017 through 2019. Hungry people is second from the bottom, only above Louisiana. So these are the poorest people. We have among the poorest people in our state, in the nation. We're tied with Mississippi. So think about that. Two of the most racist states in the nation, and we compete with them for keeping people poor. And we know that we have a very small percentage of people of color. So the people that are that poor in our state are white folks. Again, it's interesting to compare some of the poverty rate statistics from that year. They had an NA for Black people for actually the number of people, and I don't know why that didn't have a formula for that. I used the formula that I anticipated they would have used to come up with the number. But again, we're talking about people below poverty at 123,000 white people, less than 10,000 African Americans. So it's just interesting to look at stats and numbers and think about what they really mean, what they reflect. But how do we actually reclaim our humanity? And I think part of it requires that we see what's actually going on. We need to see how we got here. We need to acknowledge the history that brought us here. And again, David, I don't know if you want to say anything here about that process of reclaiming humanity, but certainly acknowledging the foolishness of segregation, the loss that we have when we don't learn from each other.
One of the things is that when we talk about humanity, we went through and probably still is suffering from a dehumanization process, right? So there had to be some process put in place to say these people, this particular group of people, are no longer considered a part of the human race, part of the species. It doesn't get the benefits nor the responsibilities of taking care of itself. It will always be our subject, and we must take care of it. So growing food, even though that was one of the jobs, we didn't get the benefits because we still didn't have the power for production and or being able to get it to market. Even then, you were still up under somebody trying to take your property or whatever it could have been. But I think right now, if you look at Maine, and we think about Maine, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people have come here for, is for a place of refuge. People are fleeing wars. People are fleeing poverty. People are fleeing just maybe just bad family situation. So if Maine have this sense of receiving refugees and people that's fleeing, then maybe it should see its citizens as fleeing this poverty that's been placed on us collectively, because if we're suffering and we're able to help another group get their thing together, and that is happening, and your people is suffering, then we have a problem. That's just a clear problem. You got to take care of yourself before you take care of other people. That's just part of it, self-preservation. And if people are working on the same thing, that means we can work together as a collective for the sake of our humanity, from people that are fleeing wars and looking for a place of safety. And I think once we get that type of mindset, then this effort for growing food and seeing that we have the proper food, it would fit for any one of Maine's citizens, not any group that says that we need some special stuff, but any group, anybody in Maine should be able to eat some good, healthy food and have a place to stay. But we're going to stick with the food, have some good, healthy food, because we're all participating in it in order to provide good food for everybody. And that's what I'm basically working on. And I think that's where we could come in together and see it as a collective effort. A collective effort. I seen some young folks that said if they was able to come out here and work with me, they'd be happy to come out here and do some good work, because they see the need and there's an opportunity. There's good air, freshness, where you could get out here and start to reintroducing ourselves to one another. That's what I think we have the opportunity to do as far as food is concerned, because it will put us into the open air and become the custodians of the property again. And I think that's about what I got to say on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Daryl. I mean, it's related. That dehumanization reminds me of when I was working in the 90s and President Clinton signed the welfare bill, and he was proud to end welfare as we know it and begin kind of some of that zero sum, where there were block grants, where there was only so many resources available no matter what happened in the economy. And I think during that period, I was one of the founders of an organization in the region called the Northeast Region Anti-Hunger Network. And we would meet, there was a group of us in the New England states and New York State, and we would talk about, what our state was doing around welfare reform. Here in Connecticut, well, they're limiting the time limit to 2 years, and they're cutting the benefits, and people have three months of training is the only option they have to improve themselves. And I was in Maine saying, well, we're maximizing. We have, again, some of those people who I stood on the shoulders of are Chris Hastett and Kit St. John and Bob Filbert, great leaders in the anti-poverty movement. And they were working really hard to make sure that Maine chose the most generous options. 5-year time limit. They had parents of scholars, which meant that a person could go to college and get a degree while they were on welfare. They did not cut the benefits. They did not. So they provided childcare. So a lot of options. And I said, well, what's going on? What's going on in Connecticut? What's going on in New York? It's not happening in Maine. And then you look at this picture and you look at the faces of the poor, and they are identified as people of color. In Maine, it was before the recent arrival of refugees. And so again, Maine, the face of poverty was very white. And so there was a humanization and understanding by the legislators, by the people that are making this decision, that people that were going to be taking part in this program could look like them, could be them. And so that's where we saw that Maine had more empathy, was more sympathetic, was more humane, and weren't demonizing people who are in poverty as much as other states. And yet, there was a big shift as immigrants arrived, we had the person who called himself Donald Trump before Donald Trump was Donald Trump, really perpetuating some racial stereotypes and reattaching that sense of poverty to a different face. And we shifted, and we were one of the few states that wouldn't even accept Medicaid money, and to shut people out of health insurance. So we saw a big shift, but it's important to understand these dynamics and why these choices were made, and why how the dehumanization happens in the policy process based on the stories that are told, beginning with President Reagan and the welfare queen, and people talking about it's really crazy things that people say about policy choices. And it's really important that we tell different stories. I mean, this picture tells a pretty amazing story of a moment in history and the power of people standing up to unauthorized or authorized force. But what it's going to require of us is to reframe and retell that story, and acknowledge that we will not accept people being dehumanized. We will not accept people being made poor. We can change the way we organize our communities in ways that people are not. We can prevent poverty. We can prevent hunger, and we can make that choice as a community, as a collective, by the way we choose to invest our community resources. So I think it's important to just acknowledge that we live by the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell each other. But as we get more information, we're in a very, very right moment right now where some of those stories are changing. It's an economy that values whiteness, who's willing to support and invest, whether it's a neighborhood, if it's a Black neighborhood, it has less houses there, have less value. If it's a Black business, banks are less willing to invest. I think that story needs to change. And then, we may even think about the acknowledgement of our current president when he says that, people of color have never been fully welcomed into the economy. And that's, never. I mean, that's pretty significant to acknowledge that. And so if that's the case, then what do we do? What do we need to do to repair that? And again, it's the words we choose, it's the language we choose. I mean, look at this picture. What is that? Is that a peaceful protest? It really depends on how you look at that. But how you look at that is really determined by the words that are used to describe it. That is a few days after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. But, people talk about, again, the language we use to talk about people who are poor, the language we use to talk about Black rebellion, is it looting, crazy language. And it's how we choose to talk about it, it's how we choose to frame it, it's how we choose to look at it that's going to liberate us and allow us to make the choices to take care of each other. So with that, there are some policies that are happening right now that have the opportunity. I think one of them, just this past week, Representative Talbot Ross put in draft language about a month ago to establish the Main Truth Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. We've decided probably in the last week or so to kind of put that on hold because it won't make it through the session. So rather than putting it up for a vote and getting it voted out, we're going to hold on to that. But again, it's hard to say whether people will support that because they're afraid of our history. People have both a personal, visceral response to owning, our complicity in the suffering of people in our nation, as well as, just a lot of denial about wanting to believe that we're the greatest nation on earth, and what that pride does to our image of ourselves as a nation in terms of denying and not being humble. So it's whether this is going to be talked about, and it's going to be an opportunity to really bring truth forward. I think it's important that we have the process talking about this opportunity, this bill, and this opportunity to change the story, tell different stories, again, whether it passes or not. Another really important bill that has passed, and right now, actually tomorrow morning, if you want to, I'm going to drop a few links in the chat, if I can copy them here from my notes, is the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations is pretty foundational law that is passed. Right now, what's missing is the funding. We know it's going to take at least $2 million to do this right. And right now, in the governor's budget, there's about $500,000. So we have the opportunity tomorrow to request 4 times that amount of money. So we want to show up tomorrow. And the wheels are spinning. I think, yeah, those links went into the chat. So there's a couple links there. One of them will take you to Maine Equal Justice webpage, which will give you instructions. And the other one is talking points on the permanent commission and the funding. So those are a couple pieces of information in the chat. So that the policies that are being considered right now to improve conditions of people of color in our state. The last thing that is important to the Cumberland County Food Security Council, and it's really an exciting legislation process, is, and again, this was signed by the governor in May of 2019. Dowden and I and Amy Carrington on our board of directors and a bunch of other people were part of. Penny Jordan led the process of the interim report. It's about to be reinvigorated in the next couple of weeks. We took it to the legislature in March of 2020, about a week before everything shut down, and the Ed Committee unanimously voted to fund it. Of course, when the pandemic hit, everything was kind of in upheaval, and so we're just getting back around to doing that work. But the bigger point is, it's an opportunity to end hunger in Maine by 2030. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to take seriously the root causes of hunger, which again, if you've been paying attention to this presentation, my bias is that it's racism and structural racism and the dehumanization of people that results from structural racism. And so our goal is to make sure that's clear in the process. And I think the people that are leading it now at the Department of Agriculture are clear on that. They're bringing that perspective to the table as well. So again, there'll be some information going out. I know my organization is hosting a meeting in Cumberland County. There's going to be regional groups that meet to begin that process, to reinvigorate that process. There's 8 regional groups in the state. There's going to be some strategic groups that also will be informing those regional groups. And we're going to work together to end hunger by 2030. And I believe that can happen. And again, my bias is it's as simple as acknowledging that the way we organize our communities is a choice we make. We make it at the policy level, we make that at the community level, we make that in our households, by who we buy our food from. We make it with every choice we make. And so when we agree to that, it's possible. So we just all have to believe it and get behind it. And we can do that and be the first state to really, we are the first state to actually make such a bold commitment. Because when it first happened, I mobilized some interns to look and do a literature review and see if anyone else is really crazy enough to say they're going to end hunger. But a lot of people think, well, historically, the poor and the hungry have always been with us. Well, so what? It doesn't have to be the future. So let's retell that story and change that future. So with that, I think you have an opportunity to go to the chat. If you want to get in touch with either Daoud or I, there's our email addresses. I'm going to look and see if there's any questions or any thoughts in the chat. I was hoping this could be a little more interactive, but this format, while it has a lot of advantages, I think it does have some limits in terms of interaction. So thank you all who have been paying attention. Hopefully it's been interesting enough for you to stay with us. I don't know, Daoud, do you want to say anything to close out?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the Permanent Commission on the racial status on race, and I can't see it. Indigenous and tribal. That's a process to help humanize the populations. When you speak about tribal, that's more or less like a family connection. It's basically a family, larger families, and it's blood connection, and you become a tribe, and that's a natural order. That's a natural process to be recognized as a particular group of people. when you're mentioning indigenous, you're claiming that you was here on the land and been here for a long time. Sometimes people identify that being before Columbus and his discovery and his adventures. And then when you speak in racial, it's kind of like helping us to understand that we're beyond this structural race, if that's what we want to call it. But we're one particular race, we're one human race, one human family, and that's what I think this commission was making an attempt to do. So it's not a spooky thing that, oh wow, we're going to look at the tribals and things of that nature. I think this is part of the humanizing process to begin to look at people and say, what family did you come from? You know, what tribe? Because you know the African Americans don't come from tribe. They don't have any tribe. They don't have any real connection with that. They just some people that's tribeless, uh, foreign to the country and things of that nature. So a lot of those stories, a lot of those things could be corrected by humanizing the experience and not continue to live with the old stories that we've been told. When I'm thinking about African Americans, I'm thinking about that whole process that brought us to that particular understanding as to who this group of people are. Originally, they were called American Indians. Then they went from American Indians to coloreds and Negroes and blacks and all those other things. So if you're going to do anything in this process, you don't want to continue to dehumanize this group of people. You want to move them to a more humanized position. And African American is not the thing that humanized this group that was considered Negroes and blacks and coloreds and things of that nature. I think we have to go to a point where we can honestly identify them correctly, and that will put them back into the human status.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. And again, I'm glad you're calling attention to the Permanent Commission because it's a platform as much as it is anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of different initiatives coming out of that commission, including work on, community land access, resources invested in sharing land, cooperative land ownership, the whole the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Commission will be based out of that permanent commission. So it's really important to invest the resources. A lot of the data that documents the disparate outcomes is going to be held in that commission archives and database so that we can identify where the problems really lie, where the most vulnerable people are, where we've got to invest those resources to make those changes. So all of that is really important that we have the resources to enable us to make changes that are going to be recommended by this commission. And again, if you search it, you can see there's a report. I don't have that handy. But the Permanent Commission report lists the commission members, but they've been meeting at the same time legislature's been going on. They've been putting out a few different legislative initiatives. And again, it's as a permanent commission, it's going to be a huge platform going forward for us to address inequities in this state as it relates to different populations. Again, I open it up for any questions, thoughts, suggestions, anything we should know about, anything the community in this room should know about.
I think it's up to us when we end. So if nobody has any questions, we can end the session. Or if you all want to, oh, Jesse has one in the Q&A. Here we go. Jesse Sapphire says, I know we may not have time for questions, but if there's time, I'd love to hear more about the distinction between truth and reconciliation and truth, racial hearing, and transformation. I don't know, do you all have additional things to add? I feel like you've talked about that.
I mean, I summarized it based on what I heard Heather McGee say, and the reason the distinctions. There's a whole movement, actually, around the truth, racial healing, and transformation. I mean, they're looking at these commissions worldwide. I think part of it emerged from seeing some of the limitations of just truth and reconciliation, that maybe reconciliation isn't enough. So how do you heal and transform? So yeah, I think in most from across communities that really recognize that it's going to take more than just getting back to some idyllic state that maybe never even existed. Because again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened with the Wabanaki in the state of Maine was focused specifically on kind of the child trauma and taking the children from families, and so it was pretty narrow and specific. And even so, it's hard to know how much of that trauma was healed in that process, and if enough was done to rehumanize those communities. So, I mean, that's a good question, Jesse, and I appreciate it. And I think if you Google it, you'll see a lot of places that our communities are taking this on. And we have some really smart people in the state who are connected to those national and global efforts as well, who are leading in putting this legislation together and in envisioning what this process can look like. But again, so much of it is really, what are the stories that we haven't told about our history? What have we avoided and ignored? I mean, I was in the Black Box workshop prior to this, where they were talking Atlantic Black Box. There was an initiative that's reclaiming some of that history around the slave trade in New England, and how integrated it was into our success in business, and all the different ways in the cotton that traveled from the South to the mills in Lewiston, et cetera. So there's so many connections that we don't want to acknowledge and don't want to admit, that we really need to revisit that history, tell the true stories. Don't be afraid of people that, I mean, you hear people say, well, people today never enslaved anyone, and the people today were never enslaved. Okay, well, that's an accurate assessment. And look at the disparate outcomes for the people who are ancestors of people that were enslaved, and look at the wealth that for people who maybe never enslaved anybody, but inherited because of their ancestors profiting from that. So it's really important that we do, own that history, acknowledge that history, and work together to create a new history. And again, I think Maine is a unique and right place for that, because of the accessibility of our legislature and our legislators and the leadership we have right now. And I think this moment is particularly right because of all the resources. And, I think we need to, even if we don't get there, we need to start laying the path towards those. I mean, in the 90s, we had a Blue Ribbon Commission on Hunger and Food Security. And then a few years later, we had a Millennium Commission on Hunger and Food Security. And we made some recommendations about earned income tax credit and things like that for families that have access to resources. We would not realistically implement those or devote resources to that. But now in 2021 with the pandemic, you're realizing, the vulnerability of families with kids and the vulnerability of children, from the top in our nation, the president is, paying families hundreds of dollars a month for every kid. What? Where did that come from? And how is that possible? And what does that really mean? And then if we're doing that now, in this moment of so-called crisis, then what does it really mean in terms of what we need to do to support and heal this country? and take care of each other, take care of our families with young children. Again, the fact that the biggest risk factor for hunger and poverty in this state, in this nation, is being a child. People are sympathetic to that on the one hand, but we need to do much, much more than sympathy. We need to invest the resources to change that.
I just want to add to that, Jim, that the way I see it is I had a conversation with a friend of mine a couple of years back, and I asked him, I said, man, whatever happened to the revolution? He said, Dawood, that's an old concept. What we're doing is we're evolving, because we don't want to keep repeating the same thing. So we have to rise up just a little. And I think that's the difference. Reconciliation basically winds up to repeat the same thing over and over again. You just constantly apologize and acting as though nothing actually happened. But when you transform, you have to go up a notch. And I think that's basically what we want to do at this particular time. We don't want to really continue to repeat the same thing. We want to be bold enough to kind of lift ourselves up to evolve, just not much, but just enough not to keep repeating the same thing. So I think that's pretty much the difference that I see in those two.
And I highly recommend Heather's book. Again, she came here, the Maine Center for Economic Policy distributed a bunch of her books to folks who attended that conference. She wrote a chapter on Lewiston, the dynamics there, and just really the whole concept of, kind of the zero-sum attitude towards investing in communities just is not working. And that's part of what led me to propose this workshop, is some of the dynamics that are happening in the state that Dawood and I talk about when it comes to immigrants and refugees arriving, and suddenly there's a whole lot of investment in that community at the expense of folks that have been here a long time and folks that have been really poor, kind of being pushed to the side and forgotten. It doesn't have to be either or. Everyone needs to be invested in, and there are resources to invest in everybody. That just transition needs to happen, where the folks that are most vulnerable are the ones that we need to pay most attention to and invest the most resources in making sure that their needs are met. So this is part of that conversation, Tyler. I know we got to continue it, but today was part of that.
I think this is the beginning. I just want to share this, just one quick thing about healing, right? Is that I remember when I had to get my tooth taken out, right? They offered me some pain medication, and I think they gave me like 6 of them. And they had the warning, may cause drowsiness, only take 1 or 2, blah, blah, blah. And I was in so much pain that I took 2 of them because I wanted to get rid of the pain. It had a bad effect. I mean, I got sick and everything. And I'm sharing that to say that we may be in some pain at this particular time, but let's not take so much medication that we get sick. Just take the recommended dose and see if we could tolerate that. But we will get through it, because healing is painful. Healing is a painful process, but once it's healed, you be good, and hope that you get it set properly, so when we do heal, that we be functioning in the right way. So I just want to share that with you.
We can give people time back if there's no further questions. And you're a little bit early. It's been a great day and a long day, and I'm really grateful. Thank you, Tyler. Really grateful to
Thank you.
Philanthropy Partners for doing this conference and having this focus. It's been really powerful for me. And I guess the thing I would end on is when I started this journey of anti-racism, when I first got exposed to training by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond 20 years ago or more. It was pretty lonely doing this work. And it's not so much anymore. There's a lot of people whose eyes have opened. I hesitate to use woke or awakened because I wake up every day and I'm still on this journey and I still got more work to do. So it's not like there's a moment where I woke up because, again, I've had my moments where I thought I was, as Dad would say, pretty badass and knew what was going on when it came to, being an anti-racist. But there's just so much, like this whole movement with the truth, racial healing, and transformation. This is a new emerging academic discipline, but it's also grassroots and it's an organizing strategy. So there's people coming at it, from all different directions. And unfortunately, it took the death of George Floyd to really push the people forward and to really, look and say, this is intolerable. We can't accept this anymore. So for what it's worth, what his daughter said is that he was going to change the world. It's changing and we're doing it. So let's stay together, stick together, keep working. Don't let up. We still got a lot to do together.
Yep. All righty.
Thanks, everybody.
And thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you back for tomorrow's day's worth of activities.
All right.
Thanks to our presenters. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
All right.